Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm co-director with Robin Ewing of the Create Centre, which is hosting tonight's webinar. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that this webinar is taking place on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. And I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging. And kind of just affirm that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thanks very much for joining us this evening, and I'm going to throw to Robin Ewing, who's going to introduce our presenter for this evening.
Thanks, Michael. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Carol tonight. Carol is Professor of Critical Studies in Education at the University of Auckland. She's had a long and varied career as a classroom teacher, an educational leader, a policy advisor, a researcher, and a writer. And along the way, Carol's also used her own personal experiences of some of the things that she's going to talk about tonight to help lots of other people experiencing trauma and disaster in their lives. Since 2010, Carol's been researching the role of schools in helping children, young people and communities cope with disaster and recovery, of course, in New Zealand, but not only in New Zealand, around the Asia Pacific more broadly. Her research has been awarded a University of Auckland Research Excellence Medal, and she is also the Education Commissioner for the National Commission for UNESCO. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Carol. We're really looking forward to hearing about disaster, serendipity, and stories about toy bears.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. So as you heard, I want to pull some threads together, some threads that revolve around my personal experience, but also in how to take opportunities that seem to be a little bit unexpected and use them in ways that can have a much broader impact. And for me, what I've chosen this evening to also be a little bit entertaining is my journey with some stuffed bears. But first, thank you for your acknowledgement of country, and I will do the same from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So ko auraki te maunga, ko mawhera nui te awa, ko tuhinga amua te kainga, ko taipotini te rohe, ko te waiponamu te motu, ko moana nui a kiwa te moana, ko Carol Mutch, te tangata e noho atu nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, in which I recognise that we all are connected to the land, and we share who we are and where we're from by locating ourselves with the mountain that means something to us. And for me, it's Aoraki, also now possibly you know it as Mount Cook, and my river, Mawhera Nui, also known as the Grey, and my town, Cobden, and the west coast of the South Island where I'm from. So you now get an understanding of who I am and what matters to me and why the land is so important to the Indigenous people of Aotearoa and also to those of us who've come after. But the story I want to tell you is beginning on March the 25th, 2020. And on this particular night, our then Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, put our entire country into a COVID-19 lockdown. And although I work in Auckland, my home, a current home, is in rural Canterbury in the South Island. So once I heard the announcement, I think we were given 24 hours to go to the place where you would find yourself for the next few weeks or months, depending how long that lockdown would go on. And so home I went, and my husband and I sort of hunkered down, checked that we had enough water and baked beans and goodness knows what else to get us through the pandemic. But at the same time, I had to continue working. I had to repurpose all my teaching materials, so my lecture notes, my tutorials, the workshops, the seminars, and I had to spend hours making cute little videos to engage my students and finding opportunities for things that they could do while they were hunkering down wherever they were. So I found it a long, stressful time in lockdown, and especially living in the country with very intermittent phone and internet connections, I needed something to take my mind off these things. One of the good things, and I think people looking back to the first lockdown in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was it was a beautiful, calm autumn. And we were all encouraged to go for walks, to take our time and go outside. And I think my husband and I walked more than we ever had done, even though we live out in the country, up one big road, down the other road. And so did everybody. And someone started this idea of putting your teddy bears in your windows so that when children were out on their walks, they could go do a little, teddy bear search and find all the teddy bears. I didn't have a teddy bear, and we do live down a long driveway. So instead, I got my son's bear. So this is Bear, and yes, he's huge. And there's a story behind Bear. I'm an older mother, and I had my son and then hoped to have a few more children after that, but sadly just seemed to have miscarriage after miscarriage. And sorry, that gets emotional, doesn't it? But when my son was about 5 and we really thought that we might have our very last chance, and I lost another baby, he said to me, why can't I have a baby sister? And it's hard to tell a 4 or 5-year-old why they can't have a baby sister. So I went out and I bought this big bear. I thought he needs something to hug. And so Bear has been a member of our family ever since then. And even though you tidy up and you throw out some of your children's toys, Bear never got thrown away. So I got him out of the toy box along with a whole lot of other toys that you'll meet very soon. And I plonked him on the gatepost, and there he sat. But as you can see, we live in the country. He had a long, tiring, rather boring day. And on one of the stories I wrote about Bear, he said, today's count was 1 tractor, 2 cars, and a man on a bicycle. And on that first day, I brought him back inside and I threw him on the sofa, and he flopped his arms back and he looked at me, and I was sure he said, you can't put me back in the toy box now. I'm in your bubble. And so suddenly I photographed him. I put it up on Facebook, thought everybody would get a little bit of a laugh. Little did I know that Bear took off. He just captured everybody's imagination. People kept asking, well, when's his next story? And I had heaps of stories because, of course, this was new for all of us. We were doing things like we had to have a designated shopper. So only one person per bubble could go shopping. And all these things that suddenly came into our lives. And one I even remember that's a bit embarrassing now is there was something doing the rounds of the internet where you're supposed to wash your groceries before you put them away. We were doing strange things because we weren't sure if we were ever going to survive this pandemic. And so the stories of Bear became my sanity saver. I organised my life so that I did my work, and just before I went to sleep, I thought about what's something cute I can write about this big bear. And then in breaks during the next day, my husband and I planned these things. Now, I photographed them all on my cell phone. That these were not meant to be very fancy, professional things, but I couldn't believe how they took off. So my friends posted them to their friends who posted them to their friends. And then, people in Scotland are sending my bear pictures of their bears and pictures of their bears actually looking at my bear on their computer, all kinds of crazy things. And so it meant that once we'd started this avalanche of bear stories, we had to carry on. So I just thought I'd share with you some of what these stories looked like. So here's a few. as we say, I live in the country, and here's Bear. Today I went to check on my neighbours. The cows were pleased to see me, but I had to remind them about social distancing. The sheep, on the other hand, they were not interested. They said COVID-19 was just a bovine conspiracy for cows to take over the world. Sheep, where do they get their ideas from? And so I wasn't actually writing it for children. I was just writing whatever crazy story came into my head. But as these stories all came together and told the story of our lockdown, including the sad story of my aunt dying in lockdown at the time when even relatives couldn't go. This was very early on, and relatives couldn't go and see their loved ones. And in the first story there, Bear is trying to make sense of what do you do when you can't go and visit someone or send flowers and so on. And so these were very real things that everybody was dealing with. But someone in one of the posts said what they would like is, could I pull some of the posts together and actually make them into a story, because they thought that would be a nice thing to read to their children, and also gave them an opportunity to discuss some of these things like death and how do you deal with that when these things are quite scaring us. So again, it wasn't a professional production. It was the best that I could possibly do on a Word document with A4. And as you can see on the slide there, that, a nice simple sort of title and just a text box down the side. And that particular one there says, this is Bear leaving the toy box, because I had to kind of repurpose the narrative to make it make sense. I said goodbye to the toys. Everyone has to go into lockdown, I told them. Stay safe in your bubble till I come back. The humans shut the lid of the toy box and I started my new life. Oops. And so the stories sort of became adapted to these two levels. There was the sort of the make the grown-ups laugh level, and also then have cute little stories for children, so that it could bring adults and children together to talk about their lockdown experience by sharing them the stories of Bear. And if you look closely, you will see that I needed to get my husband to help me with these, because we achieved it by either sticking Bear together with masking tape so that he would stick to something and look like he was sitting up, or tying him up with invisible fishing line so that he could hold him by the head while I snapped a photograph. So you can see the different ways in which we tried to make him look. So we'll just hear a few little Bear stories. In the top right-hand corner, he has been moping around. He didn't want to get out of bed the day before, and then he woke up the next day, as we all did. We had those days. A new start. Today I've decided to stop moping about. First, I found jobs to do around the home. Next, I checked my Facebook page to see how my friends were doing. It's much more fun when you get out and do stuff. Today I helped in the garden. I mowed zigzag shapes on the lawn. I watered the weeds and dug up the roses. My humans suggested I might like to stay inside tomorrow. Did I do something wrong? That was later. That was one of the ones that the children told me they enjoyed the most. But the other thing in the bottom right-hand corner is that during that first lockdown, we had Easter, we had Anzac Day, we had all these things that we were sort of sharing as a community, but on our own, in our own little bubbles. So here's Easter Sunday. Today was Easter Sunday. The Prime Minister said the Easter Bunny was an essential service, and she did. But I was worried he might run out of Easter eggs before he found me. When I woke up, there were no Easter eggs, but 3 clues. I needed to go on an Easter egg hunt. Clue number 1. I'm red and black, but I'm not a rugby team. I know the letterbox. And again, when the children started talking about these stories, the bear's bum coming out of the letterbox was one of their favourites. And from there, just repackaging these and making them available, they found their way onto 2 different educational websites. On the bottom left there is the Education Hub. And the person who organises that very generously took every little book I wrote, the 4 in the Bear series and the next 4 in the Berry series and so on. And they just, thousands of people downloaded them. With my colleague, Peter O'Connor, that I know you all know, we also put together the Tirito Toy site. And on that site, Peter had someone use the bear stories and write activities for teachers, which were about dealing with emotions and coping with trauma and so on. So that was a much more practical way in which people could follow lesson plans. But that led me to thinking about, well, here's a research opportunity. What am I going to do now? So while we're still in lockdown, of course, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't go to schools. I couldn't go to visit people. And so with one of my doctoral students, I thought, well, why don't we organise a study where we get parents or carers to read to their children in sort of conversational ways and then just record whatever happens. And so we got the ethics to do that, and we put it up on various sites, on the university site, on the Education Hub site, to see if we could get people who'd be willing to do that. And we got, I think, about 8 to 10 family groupings of different ages, and just simply ask them, read the books, however many you want, in whatever way you want, but as you would normally do, just in a conversational tone and so on. And don't feel embarrassed about what you say. What we're interested in is how the children are responding. And so they did that, and they sent the recordings back to me. I've got a few notes on there about the ethics. We wanted to make sure that children weren't sort of coerced by their parents into participating. And they had to return little forms where they agreed. And we also asked the parents to not keep the recordings or, use them on any kind of social media or whatever, just to delete those, but they could keep the transcripts. So what did we find? As the children listen to the stories and either the parents ask questions or the children ask questions, we got a really nice insight into what they were thinking, what was at the front of their minds. And initially, we got lots of stories of loss. They really missed their friends. They really missed school. Not so much for the learning part of school, but just for the regularity and the place and some of the activities that they liked. They certainly missed playgrounds and sports activities and those sorts of things that they weren't able to do, and special places that they went to, whether that is the mall or whether that is the beach or whatever mattered to them. And what we could hear as they raised these issues, because Bear was really missing his friend Alligator, and so that gave them an in to being talking about, well, what are the things that you're missing? And you could hear parents kind of calming the children and distracting them and using really nice techniques to get them to sort of reframe how they were feeling. And you also heard that the parents would say, yes, but, we're doing these sorts of things, and you've got to learn about the new routines and the new activities. I mean, everybody did baking, surely, gardening. There were sort of common elements that we got into and so on when we were at home. And especially for the first 2 weeks of our lockdown, because they made the school holidays come 2 weeks earlier in order for teachers to be able to get ready for what was going to come in terms of online teaching. So there were these lovely 2 weeks of autumn sunshine where families actually did get together, and many people hadn't yet reorganised their lives to be working from home. And so there tended to be quite a lot of family bonding at that time. And that was exactly when we were getting this data. And we also noticed that as the parents were reading these stories, initially they were doing things like What do you think cross-contaminate means? But as they read more and more through the stories, they kind of relaxed, and the children sort of took over and started adding to the stories, and the parents took much more of a back seat. So some of the themes that we came across when we were doing our analysis was really interesting, that while the children had this sense of loss, as they engaged more with the stories, we could hear them gaining in confidence and sort of gaining a bit more autonomy about the things that they were thinking about and how they were framing things. And they showed a real sense of responsibility. They understood why they were staying home, whether it was to protect grandma or whatever it was, and so on. And they were able to reason that in quite mature ways, and showed an amazing sense of compassion. And the two pictures I've got there are two pictures that two different families sent in, where the girls in that family had decided that they needed to protect their toys. And so they made masks for them and PPE and that sort of thing. And so it was interesting that this was not prompted by parents. And they also asked questions about, would their pets be safe? So they genuinely showed this care and compassion. And the other thing that we noticed was that they wove this kind of narrative between their lives and Bear's life, and found points of connection and points of difference. And as Bear moved through the different stages of the lockdown, so they were able to talk about how they'd changed over that time and become more comfortable with what this new normal was. And then the mail arrived. So first it arrived by post. In these little books I had I self-published them, if published is even the right word, and I had my home address in there. And so the mail started coming. So here's just a couple of little examples there. And you can see by this time, Alligator, who spent 2 weeks in quarantine in the bathtub, was now allowed to join our bubble. And the mail arrives, and you get to see exactly the things I've been talking about, that these are different children, but connecting to Bear. And sort of, I put one here, Dear Lockdown Bear. Oh, I love your stories. I really liked it when you fell off the trampoline. I thought that was really funny. All of your books are funny. P.S. This is you and Alligator from your friend Zoe. And so there's little insights into the connections that they were making with Bear. And then when schools reopened, by this time having been on the various educational websites, they became just this part of the return to school curriculum, as many teachers were thinking about well-being rather than thinking about, back to literacy and numeracy. And so teachers, again, without any, just spontaneously started sending us all the things that they were doing. So here at Bear and Alligator, looking at different sets of photographs of classes, or you see in the middle photograph there, the teacher has printed all the books off so that they could be read like big books. But one of my favorites was the school, or it was 2 classrooms together, where the teacher had decided that a way of bringing the children back to school and explaining these new routines would be to have them make their own Bear book. So as they came back, she explained what she was going to do. She had her bear Angus, and she was really worried that Angus wouldn't know what the rules were. So they took Angus, and because, when you first came back to school, people were put into teams or bubbles. They had to go through different gates. They had to go through the sanitizing routine. Their classrooms had the desks spread out. You couldn't share lunch boxes or drink bottles and so on. So Angus had to learn all these new rules, and they made this book, and then they were able to share the book. But of course, what a clever way of assimilating the fact that the rules have changed. This is a really easy way for you to learn and to get some sort of ownership of what you're doing. And of course, Bear wrote back to everyone, sometimes to individuals who left their names, and sometimes to whole classes. So there's Bear and Alligator to Arahui School. Thank you for your letters and drawings. Love, Bear and Alligator. Alligator became a bit of a hit as well. So once we had all this, I spontaneously had all this data, and schools were open, and with Peter and some other researchers, and that included principals and teachers and what did they do. And Peter was particularly interested in people who used the Tirito toy side, and I was interested in the teachers that had picked up the bear books to see what they had done. So we were able to turn that into another research project, and I got copies of all the bits and pieces that were related to teachers who had used the bear stories in different ways. So diagrams, some of the letters that were sent to me, photographs of what was happening in classrooms. And so what came through from that was, I mean, I know teachers are clever anyway, but I was thinking that at a time when you are sort of anxious yourself about your own health and well-being and your family, and then you're coming back to school and you're anxious about your own students, how clever they were in the ways in which they used these things. And some of the feedback I got later was that what made the bear books work was this really relatable character. He was a bit goofy and he was funny, but he also did the things that they did. It was that really important thing about connection. And from my work in sort of emotional processing after trauma, it was really important for me to think about in what ways could I see that they were doing the things that they should be doing, which is being able to express emotion, recognize emotions, express emotions, to be able to come to storying their own narrative so that they could, step back one little step from their immediate emotions and see that others were experiencing this as well. They weren't on their own, and find ways in which they could frame and reframe it so that it just became part of who they were and give them some sense of control over something that they might have thought they had no control over. And that is what, even though initially I hadn't anticipated, that was what the stories allowed them to do. So you can see that they connected with Bear. So Bear did baking and he Zoomed friends and he played games and he did gardening, as you've seen, and he slept in, and the children did many of those things. And he expressed different emotions. Sometimes he was sad or bored or happy or having fun or a bit frightened or anxious. And sometimes he was expressing love for his humans or his wonderful friend Alligator. And in the letters, for example, you can see, here's one you can hear in the child's voice almost as he wrote this. Hey, Bear, I found out that we did some of the same things. So it was kind of like excitement that, the things I did, this other fictional friend of mine called Bear did as well, just giving the opportunity for that child to make that connection. And so the big themes that came through there were the connections, as I've said, and curiosity, the questions they asked Bear. I mean, one of them said, what are your humans' names? Now, for some reason, and I don't even know why, I'd avoided using our names. We were just called the humans, and Bear would refer to us as my human. But the children were really curious as to, did the humans have names? I mean, the humans didn't figure in any of the photographs. And then there were empathetic questions. So what were your feelings? How did you feel about what was going on? And again, it's that kind of emotional maturity, that ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And of course, we could see this whole new vocabulary coming through, bubbles being used in a completely different way to what we were ever used to before, and words like sanitizing. And even the word I'd used earlier that I thought children wouldn't understand, like cross-contamination. One of the children in the first study where the parents were reading the book, the parent had said, what do you think cross-contamination means. And the answer from a child, and I would guess maybe 7, the child had said, I think it's because Bear can't go back into the toy box because he's been with the humans. And if the humans have got the virus, he might take the virus back and make all the toys sick. And I thought, wow, you didn't even need to explain cross-contamination to that child. They'd worked it out for themselves. And then in the analysis of the pictures that they had, again, connections, lots of pictures about who was in their bubble, mum, dad, and little baby, and sister, and dog, and grandma, or whoever was in their own bubble, or themselves with Bear. That was another one. This is me playing with Bear, or Bear with Alligator. They were really taken with the friendship between Bear and Alligator. And they talked a lot about the things that made them laugh in the books. So Bear falling off the trampoline, or as I've said, is Bear's bum sticking out of the letterbox. And also what came through was this creativity where they were adding new interpretations to the story, or suggesting new adventures for Bear that Bear and Alligator might like to go on. And as well, I had the opportunity to, in fact, I interviewed some, and one of my students interviewed some of the other teachers who had used these books in different ways. And so I've got a quote there from one of the teachers who used them during lockdown. So she had already come across them and had planned her online program around what she called Lockdown Bear. And here she is. We found it really helpful to have the story of Lockdown Bear. It was easy to read, and the pictures were really bright and colourful and really relatable for the children. And when we were teaching online, we had a weekly menu. We called it Lockdown Bear, and they were all the activities to do with the book and reading the book, and just through them exploring their experiences and giving them a chance to share if they wanted to. So, I thought, again, that was a great idea. In fact, I was surprised to find that the teachers weren't just doing this in New Zealand, but somebody sent me a link to a teacher in the United States who was doing exactly the same. She had to introduce the context of this being in New Zealand, way down on the other side of the world, and so on. But she had also designed her program around Lockdown Bear. And then when teachers came back to school, as I've already said, they did creative things by either making their own videos as the American ones that I'd seen, or blowing the books up, or the class we saw where they'd made their own bear book. So 2 of the teachers talking about that said they still really related to the book and the character, and they loved the humour in it. I think they particularly liked when he dug up the roses, or when he got his head stuck in the mailbox. Then afterwards, we had a whole lot of kids bring in their own soft toys. And especially for our unique learning needs kids who often struggle in the playground, it was nice for them to bring in something safe that they could play with. And another teacher says, I just Googled Carol's name. I had no idea who she was. And I found her email address, and I emailed her and I said, look, as an authentic task, I'd love for my kids to write to Bear. Would that be okay? Because they can write physical letters, and I actually want to send them. And not only did she let me send letters to her personal address, but she actually took photos of Lockdown Bear with the kids' letters. And there's a little photo up in the corner there. So thinking about both of those studies, what are some of the bigger implications? So I think one of the first things is that in times, in this case, was a pandemic. We know that children can be some of the most vulnerable groups in a crisis situation. But we also know how really important it is to respect their rights. And some of their rights, as in the Convention of Children's Rights, but also in ways that we should treat them with dignity, is that they have a right to participation in their own recovery. And in a lot of my other disaster work, I have found that adults often make decisions for children and for young people that inhibit those rights. And I felt that we found in these particular studies that they had these opportunities in which they could exercise some way in which they could take charge of their recovery. And of course, that was with, supportive adults who were giving them strategies such as reframing or distraction from rumination and all those things that they probably did instinctively. But it was important that they weren't masking children's voices and ideas and giving them those opportunities to think creatively and to problem solve and to take a little bit more responsibility for their own recovery. One of the other interesting things too was, in the media, we heard a lot about, learning loss and children slipping back and what are we going to do when they come back to school. And both in the study during lockdown and in the study after lockdown, in fact, there had been a lot of deep learning going on. And even if that deep learning was about rebuilding relationships with your family and finding out to work, the social and emotional skills that you were learning about, finding out how to work in ways in your bubble that you hadn't expected, or of opportunities for creativity. One of the people we interviewed said that at her school, the families had sent in little video clips of the things that they were doing. And in one of those video clips, there was a mother with her welding gear teaching her children, boy and girl, to weld. And I shouldn't be surprised. That's very gendered of me to say it was a mother doing the welding. But it was just, there were so many things going on that gave the children and young people these opportunities to try new things without feeling that they might fail, that because sometimes there is that fear of failure in many schools where they're a little afraid to put their hand up or to try something new, whereas it actually didn't matter if your cupcakes melted all over the tray and weren't what you hoped they would be. I just want to add a little bit of a caveat here, is that I know that wasn't the same for all children. I think perhaps in the two studies that we did, because the parents and schools kind of self-selected into this, that we may have had ones where there were more positive opportunities. Something I'm not going to talk about tonight, but we did follow up later, was working with young people in disadvantaged communities, and many of those had quite different experiences. And but that's a story for another time. But one of the things I noticed in the schools was when students went back, as I've said on that slide there, schools practiced Maslow before Bloom. In other words, you can't deal with the academic stuff until you've dealt with the security and emotional processing and feelings of belonging and coming back into a safe environment. And many schools spent several weeks, whether it was through the arts or whether it was through social and emotional learning, but ways in which they made sure that school was a safe place. And that also is about learning a new set of skills that might not necessarily be tested in school-wide or national tests. Another thing is sophisticated thinking. Just listening to those recordings of children conversing with their parents can be such an insight. I mean, I know this as an educator myself, but just to hear how they were making sense of this new situation they found them in, the reasoning ability, the analytic thinking, and the creative problem solving. And finally, the emotional maturity. Yes, we know that children did have anxiety and, even through to stories of self-harm, so serious psychological issues. But there also was a lot of opportunity to build resilience, to show empathy, to be thoughtful, I think a wonderful example of that is, this is my favorite picture of all the pictures that the students drew. After 4 weeks of writing these little stories every single day and putting them up on Facebook and turning them into books, I needed a break. So I decided that I would put Bear into hibernation. So in book number 4, Bear looks out the window and says there's snow on the mountains and frost on the ground. It's time for a bear to go into hibernation. But he leaves Alligator behind to look after his humans. And off he goes. It goes back into the toy box, and the lid of the toy box comes down. Alligator is left on his own. But this girl drew this picture of Bear back in the toy box and Alligator there, and they're both saying bye, B-U-Y. But the tears and the look at the curve in Alligator, the kind of emotion in the fact that Alligator almost wants to wrap around Bear because he's going to miss him so much. So a wonderful example of emotional maturity. And of course, Bear got famous. So yes, he turned up in little stories all over the place. I mean, much to my surprise, I could never have believed from just that single Facebook post that we would have ended up finding ourselves in magazines and newspapers. But it didn't end there, because I ended up in several lockdowns when we had gone back to work in Auckland. Especially the 4-month lockdown, which was the longest one for Auckland, that just seemed to go on and on and on. But I had a friend. This time I had a little bear called Berry, which my son had given me when I had to go and work in Mexico for a couple of weeks. And I think he was about 4 and didn't want me to be on my own. So he gave me one of his toy bears. He had a collection of toy bears. He was a sort of kid who would go to school fairs, and when everyone was cleaning up at the end, he would gather up as many toys and he would use his dollar, not for candy floss or whatever, but he would use his dollar to rescue toys, especially little bears, and bring them home. And here is Berry, one of those toys. So Berry ended up with me in my little 1-bedroom apartment in Auckland. And did I have fun with her? Because she was so little and so cute, and I could just make her do anything. And she was also so terribly naive. You can see I made her a hat out of a yogurt bottle and a little ballet dress out of bubble wrap, and she went for rides on the vacuum cleaner. Yes, I really let my imagination go loose as Berry talked about her lockdown in Auckland. And believe it or not, she took off. I mean, how do these things happen? So she got translated into Spanish. She appeared in Spanish schools. It started because a friend of mine in Argentina was curious about what I was doing, having seen it on Facebook. And then I said, well, I could get them translated into Spanish. We had a visiting scholar from Spain at the time. She translated them into Spanish. She sent them back to Spain, and they seemed to find themselves, in all kinds of interesting places. So several lockdowns and so on, the Berry stories continued. But also, while we were dealing with COVID, that didn't stop, as you well know, in Australia, other disasters happening. I know you had bushfires, I know you had floods, and we had a series of floods as well. So I was finding that my work with Berry was kind of morphing into how could I use her and her stories to help communities, especially in the case of Berry, young children, cope with what they were facing. And so as I wrote the Berry stories, some of the activities she was involved in were a little bit more explicit. So here is one of the stories in which she became a super berry. She decided that she needed a gym suit, she needed leotards and so on so that she could do her exercises. And so I cut up an old sock. Of course, I didn't have a sewing machine in my little apartment. Cut up an old sock, sewed it up by hand, and made this, sewed a bee on the front, and she eventually became Super Berry. But in this little extract, here she is. I tried jumping off the furniture to see if I could fly like a superhero. I just kept falling down. I felt very sad. What's wrong? Asked my human. I'm no good as a superhero. I can't fly, and I don't know what my superpower is, I replied. Well, not all heroes fly through the air to find the bad guys. Some ordinary people do very special things to make other people's lives better. They're my heroes, she said. Just be kind. Just be yourself. Be kind and caring, and keep making us smile. That's your superpower. So you can see how these messages about resilience and so on started creeping into the stories much more explicitly. And so I would take her with me when I was working with groups about this. So here's just off a slide when I was working with the early childhood people in Hawke's Bay recently, who are just recovering from Cyclone Gabrielle. Just coming back with these really key points about with young children, especially pre-literate children, it's about getting them to name, recognize, and express emotions so they understand how they feel, they understand how they look like, so that they can begin to make sense of what's happening to them. And the idea that using picture books is a really good way of approaching these things obliquely so that you can talk about their feelings without re-traumatizing them. And that goes along really well with other kinds of arts activities. And, I've listed a few there. But again, coming back to how do you explore ideas where you can bring out the emotions without the emotions being absolutely directly connected with the event, but through a story or another fictional character and so on that helps you make sense of it because you're looking at it through their eyes and trying to help them solve the problem and help them find strategies that you can then start to assimilate into your own way of surviving. So I'm going to end now, and I'm going to end by the book I wrote for Cyclone Gabrielle. Again, in this case, it's one of these more explicit ones where I've taken some of these important messages. I've pulled lots of the photographs I've used in all the previous books together and now have available for, the teachers working in Hawke's Bay now that they're back at school after that devastating cyclone. So this is and the other thing is this gives you a sense of a whole book. Kia ora, my name is Bear. I live in Canterbury with 2 humans and my best friend Alligator. We share a toy box with an interesting collection of toys and bears left behind when the small humans grew up and moved away. One day I was checking my Facebook page when my friend Karen posted a picture of her flooded house. I called the toys together and said, we need to do something. Yes, said Alligator. Do you remember how we helped all the children in New Zealand when they had to keep going into COVID lockdowns? And we know a little bit about the children in Hawke's Bay because we had the earthquakes in Canterbury and the fires and floods, I added. In the 2021 floods, we ended up being trapped and not being able to go anywhere, and the little bears were really frightened. We could write another book, suggested Alligator. And with that, all the toys started suggesting ideas and talking over each other until I said, slow down. What do you think the children liked about our lockdown stories? When you got stuck in the letterbox, laughed Jingle Bear. And when you played hide and seek and thought no one could see you. Or when you watered the weeds and dug up the roses and fell off the trampoline. Or what about when you tried to teach Alligator about farming, laughed Father Bear. And with that, the toys fell about laughing. Be serious, I said. What are some of the messages in the book to help children cope when they feel sad or frightened? Find someone you trust to talk about your feelings. And remember, everyone feels differently, so just be patient, said Alligator. And be kind to others and cheer them up, said Nicholas Bear. And share what you have with others in need. Helping others makes you feel better too, added Papa Bear. Check on your neighbours and friends to see if they need any help. And what are some ways you can make yourself feel better when you start to feel worried or stressed again? I asked. You can find a quiet space to chill out, suggested Bill Bear. Or hug your pets, said Baby Bear. Or spend time with your friends and family, suggested Sailor Bear. Or go outside and look for a little treasure in every day, suggested Berry. I also like to get some exercise when I start to think worrying thoughts, she added. And when you feel that you've lost everything or that things couldn't get any worse, try to find some positives and make plans for a time when things will start to get better. What would you like the future to be like? What could help you get there? The strongest people are not those who've never had difficulties, but those who learn to pick themselves up after each setback. And you'll always feel better when you have a bear to hug, laughed Mama Bear. Kia ora koutou tamariki. We know this is a difficult time. Floods are wet and messy and smelly. It takes a long time to clean up, and you might have lost very precious things. Try to be brave. There are many bears and humans caring about you all around the country. Kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Love and hugs from Bear and all the other bears. And with that, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Carol. That is just such a wonderful story. Did you know that you had you written before? Did you know that?
I write academic things, obviously.
Yeah, but for children.
No. And I think that part of the success was that I wasn't writing as if I was writing for children. Yes. You know, I think if I'd put my teacher hat on, then I think it would have become a little bit teachery and, you know, me telling them what they needed to know. But I think because actually they were authentic stories with that double layer of stories for adults so that they could laugh at the humour and, you know, children could laugh at the silliness and so on, I think they just worked.
Yeah. Just amazing. And amazing how that whole story has evolved, you know, just from something so simple to begin with and how it you know, gathered momentum as it went on. Have you got any idea of the scale of, you know, is Lockdown Bear over here too in Australia?
I don't know. I mean, I know he's in the UK, and I as I say, I know the little bear is in Spain. Oh, she is here. She is here, by the way, just in case. And yeah, she's so tiny. Look, she fits in my hand, and I think that cuteness is what sold her stories and so on. And whereas Bear is kind of big and clunky and funny, but yeah. So they're both with me now. I had to bring Bear all the way up from Canterbury. Oh, I have to put him in. There he is. In a suitcase. I had to fold him up in a suitcase to bring him up because I'm in Auckland at the moment and because I'm up at work and so on. So I folded him up and brought him up in a suitcase. So I thought if I'd ever been stopped as he's going through security and they go, "What have you got in there?" and open it up. And I say, "Oh, it's just a bear." He's wrapped up. Anyway.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, sorry.
No, go on.
To come back to that. You know, I talked about, I think that they took on a life of their own because it was a special time and also because of the connections. But I was surprised that they became, you know, so much used in schools because often, you know, teachers want the lesson plans that go with them. And yes, one of those websites did have lesson plans to go with them. But it was the fact that teachers just took something and went, there's something in this that I can use to do all the things that I need to do, because I don't know that we train our teachers very well with how to deal with children who come back after disasters. Yes, we have school counsellors and, people do learn a little bit about trauma, but I was just amazed about how they could pick something and pull out the threads of those in ways that, again, were really authentic. And so, and for me to capture so much amazing data that I could do something with, because wouldn't it have been terrible if all of that had gone by and I had no idea about the insights you could get from those little 3 to 8 year olds in the first study, or from the ways in which teachers were creatively using those. So hence the serendipity. For me, this has been an amazing serendipitous journey to get to where we are now. And it doesn't seem like it's finished.
No, it seems like it's going to go on. Did you have something you wanted to add to this discussion?
Thank you, Carol. Nice to meet you. Hi, Robin,
Nice to
Michael,
meet you.
Anna. I'm sorry I didn't attend from the beginning, but I was in another meeting with a group of drama students at the Central Queensland University. But from the little I heard, I find it extremely fascinating. It's playful, very creative. It responds to crisis, and when we talk about crisis, normally we have something quite extreme in our heads, like floods and pandemic lockdowns, but actually a crisis is a personal thing. So your teddy bears could support people in their small crises, but very important to them. So I think that it's a mediator, the bear, as a soft toy. I've used soft toys and puppets in performances with children in hospitals and schools, where the crisis was illness. And I completely empathize and agree with what you said, Carol, about the expression and recognition of emotions in a safe environment. And fiction is a safe environment. A story, a character, a performance, the body, all participate into creating that trusted fictional space where a child can open up. And it's a great learning for us as adults, as teachers or performers or nurses, to learn more about their worlds, understand more about how they feel in difficult times. So I think that what you said about the children displaying autonomy, resilience, empathy, responsibility, thoughtfulness, and a delightful sense of humor, quote from your presentation, that's exactly what I've experienced. And I think it's so important to be able to provide children with alternative strategies in times of crisis, through the arts in particular. Because as you said, Carol, yes, there are counselors and therapists and psychologists and teachers, but they all have their own agendas and different ways of approaching children. And it's hard to get close to their emotions. But a bear as soft as the big one or the tiny you had in your hand, these could become the mediator between the adult and the child. So they communicate through that toy, and that can create fantastic opportunities for sharing and for exposure in a good sense. So yes, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and thank you for that nice interpretation. Yes, that's because sometimes when you're in it, you don't often stop back and think about why it has worked. So I found that helpful. Thank you.
Could I just build on that, please? I'm popping in the chat a link to the video from one of our presentations in the Higher Degree Research Series last year from Olivia Carolis about using puppetry with a similar age group. So if you wanted to look at ways that her work overlaps. I might pop the link under your video when I post it, so people can see the link.
I've just.
I think too, Carol, your work underlines that we should never underestimate, the way that children can make, these big leaps, from things that seem, really hard to cope with for adults as well. But, we often underestimate their strength and the depth of their thinking about these things. And certainly too, sometimes sadly, in terms of what's happening in some places in Australia at the moment, we underestimate the creativity and artistry of what teachers do when they are given these kind of resources and tools. And so it's lovely to see, all of that and how much that builds on, so much of the work that's been done in the past, like Gordon Wells' work, etc. So, it's just so rich, and it's so wonderful that it's evolved in a sense.
Just if I have a minute, it's interesting because I did mention that I'd worked with young people in disadvantaged communities. And so these were people living in crowded houses where their parents may have been laid off straight away, when the pandemic hit. But I was, again, blown away by the things that they did. So some of them were working as well. Often they left school and went out and worked because they could get work when their parents couldn't, so that they could look after their families. But they took on this the sort of mantle of responsibility, where not only were they looking after their families, but a group of Pacifica young women set up a Brown Lives Matter march, because it was at the time of Black Lives Matter. So here they are, struggling to survive, trying to do their schoolwork, working to look after their families, and they came together to put this Brown Lives Matter march in their community. They were told not to by their school, they were told not to by the police, but because of pandemic things. So they organised a route in a way in which it could be done safely, and they still went ahead and did it. Other stories were of them setting up online petitions for a particular interest that they had, and none of this was mediated by adults. In fact, the adults were always the ones saying, no, you should be focusing on your schoolwork, or no, that will get you into trouble, or no, it's not good to talk. One of them joined a campaign and did a whole lot of work for the one around sorry, I've forgotten, where gay people are conversion therapy. And so her school said they thought it was dangerous territory for her to be getting into campaigning against conversion therapy, but she went ahead anyway. So here am I thinking that, yes, they would be, struggling financially, emotionally, and so on. And they were, but they stepped outside themselves and still did these amazing things. So children, young people, we do underestimate them.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I love the authenticity of all of this as well, because, so often we are giving young children, books that aren't really even books. They're being called decodables at the moment. So.
Yeah, we have exactly the same in New Zealand, the structured literacy and so on. That's just killing the joy of reading.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's what you emphasised at the beginning too, but it was there, all the way through that theme, and how this kind of learning happened, because the children were able to be agentive in what they were doing. They weren't being given texts with no meaning to try and make sense of. They were making the meaning themselves and extending it. So thank you so much. It's wonderful work.
It was fun. It was fun. It's nice to be able to come back to those stories and do something a bit more creative with them. Thank you.
Well, you're very creative and imaginative. Did you know that you had so much there?
I had no idea, but as I say, for me, it was a sanity saver to be dreaming up these crazy antics with these two little things.
Well, thank you again. It's been
my pleasure.
a wonderful presentation, and it looks like this story isn't over. There'll be more to come.
Yes. Well, we'll see. But anyway, as I say, it's taking off in sort of more workshopy ways and so on. I can actually work with teachers and they're finding interesting things to do.
Yes.
I've got a lot of following up to do now. So what are my Hawke's Bay teachers doing, and what are the other flood related teachers doing, and so on. So but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna, as always, for all your organising and setting it up, and thank you so much, Carol.
Most welcome. Okay.
Good night.
Good night. Bye.